Something is happening beneath the surface of the silver market, and almost no one watching the headlines has noticed it yet. For over a year, the story seemed simple. Silver was the metal of the future. Solar panels needed it. Supply couldn't keep up. Prices could only go one direction. But a new institutional report just quietly surfaced. And it reveals three separate forces, working at the same time from three different directions, each one chipping away at the very foundation investors have been counting on. One of them is happening inside the panels themselves. One of them is happening at the level of national power grids. And the third one is the most dangerous because it's coming from silver that was mined decades ago and is about to come back. By the end of this video, the silver narrative you thought you understood may not look the same at all. Welcome back to Precious Metals Intelligence. If this is your first time joining, this channel exists for one reason: to help serious, long-term thinkers understand what is really happening beneath the headlines in the global economy, without the noise and without the hype. Speaking, the message was always the same: silver could not lose. This belief did not come from nowhere. It was built on a story that made perfect sense on the surface. The world is moving toward clean energy. Solar panels are being installed faster than ever before in nearly every country, on nearly every continent. And solar panels need silver. Silver conducts electricity better than almost any other metal on Earth. Without it, a solar panel simply cannot function the way it needs to. So the logic followed naturally. More solar panels, more silver demand, less available supply, higher prices. It felt like simple math. And for a while, the numbers backed this up. The silver market has now been in a structural deficit for 6 straight years. That means the world has been using more silver than it has been mining, 6 years in a row. That is not a short-term imbalance. That is a long, sustained gap between supply and demand. When people saw that number, they felt reassured. They believed the deficit proved the story was true, and that it would keep proving itself year after year until prices were forced upward by simple scarcity. Because of this, many stackers and investors learned to ignore the daily noise of the market. They stopped worrying about short-term price swings caused by the Federal Reserve, by geopolitical tension, or by big financial institutions moving large amounts of metal. They told themselves that none of that mattered in the long run. The fundamentals were strong. The deficit was real. Solar demand was only going to grow. So why worry about the smaller details? This is where the story usually ends, at least the version most people have heard. But there is a problem. It is not that the deficit is fake or that solar demand has disappeared. That part of the story remains true. The problem is something quieter, something most people have not been told. Underneath the surface, 3 separate and powerful forces have begun working against this narrative at the exact same time. None of them are dramatic on their own. None of them would make headlines by themselves. But together, they are beginning to change the shape of the silver market in ways that very few people are prepared for. This warning does not come from speculation or fear. It comes from a newly released report by a respected voice in metals analysis, someone who studies these markets professionally and has no interest in exaggeration. The report does not claim that silver is finished, or that the bull market is over. It makes a more careful and more serious point. It says that the story investors have been relying on, the simple idea that solar alone guarantees endless scarcity, is no longer as solid as it once seemed. This matters because so many people have built their entire investment thinking around a single idea. They believe that as long as solar keeps growing, silver has to keep rising. It is an easy story to understand, and easy stories are comforting. But comfort is not the same as accuracy. Markets rarely move in straight lines, and they rarely reward people who stop asking questions. What follows in this analysis is not designed to create panic. It is designed to bring clarity. 3 forces are now working quietly against the solar narrative that so many have depended on. One of them is happening inside the panels themselves, as engineers find new ways to use less silver than before. Another is happening far away from the panels, buried inside the electrical grids that are supposed to carry their power. And the third is perhaps the most surprising of all because it involves silver that was mined decades ago, sitting in old panels. The first force does not begin in a mine, or in a bank, or in a government office. It begins somewhere far quieter, inside a factory, on an assembly line, where engineers spend their days solving a single stubborn problem. That problem is cost, and the solution they have found carries enormous consequences for anyone holding silver. Solar panels need silver because of one simple fact. Silver conducts electricity better than almost any other material available. Manufacturers use it to print thin conductive lines across each solar cell, allowing electricity to flow smoothly once sunlight strikes the panel. There's no easy substitute that performs this job as well. But silver is expensive, and it makes up a significant share of what it costs to build a single panel. For companies competing to sell millions of panels around the world, every gram of silver adds up. So, for more than a decade, engineers have been working on a quiet but determined mission. They have been trying to use less silver without losing performance. Industry insiders call this process thrifting. It is not a dramatic word, and it does not sound like a threat. But thrifting has slowly and steadily reduced the amount of silver required to build a single solar panel, year after year, often without much public attention. At first, the shift happened gradually. Engineers found small efficiencies here and there, shaving a little silver off each design. But recently, the pace has begun to accelerate. The industry is now moving toward newer, more advanced panel designs, often referred to by names like TOPCon and HJT. These newer designs actually required more silver than older panels when they were first introduced. On the surface, that might sound like good news for silver demand, but manufacturers were never going to accept that cost increase quietly. In response, companies have aggressively pursued two major changes. The first is copper plating, which replaces a portion of the silver paste with copper, a metal that is far cheaper and much more abundant. The second is aluminum substitution, using specialized aluminum alloys in place of silver wherever the engineering allows it. Neither copper nor aluminum performs quite as well as silver, but they perform well enough, and the savings are enormous. If a major manufacturer can replace even a third or half of the silver used in a panel, they can save an extraordinary amount of money across millions of units. For a public company answering to shareholders, that kind of saving is difficult to ignore. This is the part of the story that most silver investors have not fully considered. The report at the center of this analysis points out something important. The rate at which silver is being removed from each panel is now accelerating faster than new mining supply can grow. In simple terms, the industry is winning a race that most silver holders did not even know was happening. Each new generation of solar panels tends to require a little less silver than the one before it, even as total solar installations continue to rise around the world. This does not mean solar demand for silver is disappearing. It is still a major source of industrial use, and it will likely remain one for many years. But the assumption that solar demand will keep climbing in a straight line, forever increasing the pressure on limited silver supply, is no longer accurate. The relationship is far more complicated than that. As panels become more efficient with silver, the same number of installations requires less total metal than it once did. For long-term investors, this is not a reason for panic. It is a reason for clarity. The silver market cannot be understood through a single simple equation anymore, if it ever truly could be. Demand and technology move together, constantly adjusting to one another. Engineers are not sentimental about silver. They do not care about its investment story. They care about solving problems and reducing costs, and they will continue chipping away at silver usage wherever the technology allows it. This first force, quiet and technical as it may seem, sets the stage for the second one, because even as panels use less silver individually, a much larger question remains. How many panels can actually be built and connected to the world's power systems in the years ahead? That question leads directly into a very different kind of obstacle, one that has nothing to do with chemistry or engineering, and everything to do with the physical limits of the electrical grid itself. The second force has nothing to do with chemistry and nothing to do with engineering. It has to do with something far more basic, something most investors rarely think about when they picture the future of solar power. It has to do with wires, transformers, and substations. In simple terms, it has to do with the electrical grid itself, and the grid is running into a wall that no amount of silver demand can push through. For years, the growth of solar power looked unstoppable. New installations appeared across entire countries at a pace that seemed to accelerate every single year. Analysts became used to drawing straight lines upward on their charts, assuming that if solar had grown quickly last year, it would grow even faster the next. This assumption quietly became one of the strongest pillars holding up the silver bull case. More panels meant more silver demand, and the growth curve seemed endless. But a solar panel does not generate value simply by existing. It must be connected to a power grid before its electricity can actually reach homes, businesses, and factories. And this is where the story becomes far more complicated than most people realize. Building a solar farm is one challenge. Connecting that solar farm to an aging, often outdated electrical grid is an entirely different challenge. And in many parts of the world, it has become the harder one. Across Europe and North America, thousands of solar projects are currently sitting finished, or nearly finished, while they wait in long queues for grid connection approval. These are not small delays measured in weeks. In many regions, developers are waiting years simply for permission to plug their completed solar farms into the existing power network. The panels exist, the land is ready, the investment has already been made, but the grid itself, built decades ago for a very different kind of energy system, cannot absorb the sudden flood of new, intermittent power fast enough. This bottleneck is not a temporary glitch that will disappear on its own. Electrical grids are enormous, expensive, and slow to upgrade. They involve permits, engineering studies, environmental reviews, and massive capital investment, often stretched across many years. A government cannot simply decide overnight to expand its national grid to match the pace of solar construction. The infrastructure takes time to catch up, and in many countries, it is falling further behind, not closer to solving the problem. Because of this, something important is beginning to happen to the growth rate of solar capacity itself. It is not stopping, it is not reversing, but it is beginning to mature, to level off, in a way that very few silver forecasts have accounted for. The explosive, ever-accelerating growth that investors became used to is starting to slow down, not because the world no longer wants solar power, but because the physical system required to use that power simply cannot keep up. This matters enormously for silver. If the pace of new solar installations begins to level off, even while individual panels are using less silver due to the forces discussed earlier, then the total demand growth that investors have been counting on starts to look very different than expected. It is worth remembering that global solar capacity is still increasing. Nobody is suggesting solar is in decline, but the difference between steady, healthy growth and the aggressive exponential growth that was priced into many bullish forecasts is enormous, and that difference has real consequences for silver's future demand curve. There is one more layer worth understanding here. As grid bottlenecks slow solar expansion, they also create pressure elsewhere in the materials market. Some manufacturers, facing rising costs and slower deployment timelines, are leaning even harder into cheaper alternatives like copper, accelerating the very thrifting trend explored earlier. In this way, the first and second forces are not separate stories happening by coincidence. They are connected, feeding into one another and quietly reshaping the assumptions that silver investors have relied upon for years. None of this means the solar story is finished, or that clean energy will fail to expand in the coming decade. It almost certainly will continue expanding. But the pace matters, the timing matters, and for anyone who built their silver outlook on the idea of unstoppable, ever-accelerating solar growth, this second force deserves careful attention. Yet even this is not the most surprising part of the report. The third force is different from the first two because it does not come from new technique. The third force is different from the first two. It does not come from new engineering, and it does not come from limits on future growth. It comes from the past. Specifically, it comes from silver that was mined and used decades ago, silver that many investors assumed was gone for good. That assumption is about to be proven wrong. To understand this force, it helps to look back to when commercial solar power first became widespread. The earliest major waves of solar installations happened roughly 15 to 25 years ago. At that time, silver was far cheaper than it is today, and none of the thrifting techniques discussed earlier had been developed yet. Manufacturers had little reason to conserve silver because it simply was not expensive enough to worry about. As a result, those early panels were built using significantly more silver per unit than any panel manufactured today. Those panels are now old. Solar equipment does not last forever. After roughly 15 to 25 years of operation, panels begin reaching the end of their useful life. They lose efficiency, they degrade, and eventually they are decommissioned and replaced with newer models. This is a completely normal part of any energy technology's life cycle. But it creates a consequence that very few silver investors have thought carefully about. Millions of these aging panels are now being retired at the same time, and every one of them contains a meaningful amount of high-grade silver, more than any panel being manufactured today. This has created an entirely new industry built specifically around recovering that silver. Specialized recycling facilities are opening with one clear purpose: extracting valuable metal from decommissioned solar equipment before it is discarded. According to the very report driving this analysis, this secondary supply of recycled silver is expected to grow substantially in the coming years. This matters because of where that silver is heading. As recycling operations expand and become more efficient, the silver they recover does not disappear into storage. It re-enters the market. Some of it is already beginning to flow back into major depositories, including exchange vaults that traders and institutions watch closely. In other words, silver that was mined decades ago, used in the earliest solar installations, and long assumed to be permanently consumed, is starting to return to active circulation. There is a striking irony hidden inside this development. The old solar industry, built during an era when silver was cheap and used generously, is now beginning to supply raw material for the new solar industry, an industry that has spent years trying to reduce its silver use through thrifting. Instead of relying entirely on freshly mined silver pulled from the ground, manufacturers may increasingly draw upon this returning wave of recycled metal. This directly reduces the pressure on newly mined supply, and it works to ease the very structural deficit that has defined the silver market for 6 consecutive years. None of this suggests the deficit will disappear overnight. Recycling infrastructure takes time to scale, and demand from other industries, including electronics, electric vehicles, and data centers, continues to grow alongside solar. But this third force adds something the silver market has not had to seriously account for in a long time: a meaningful and growing source of supply that does not depend on digging a single new mine. Taken together, these three forces do not necessarily mean the silver bull market is finished. What they mean is something more precise and arguably more important. The simple story that many investors have relied upon: The idea that solar demand alone guarantees endless scarcity and rising prices is no longer sufficient on its own. The real picture is more layered, shaped by engineering decisions, infrastructure limitations, and the quiet return of decades-old metal into modern markets. Understanding these forces does not require panic. It requires clarity, patience, and a willingness to look past the easiest version of the story.